This was supposed to be a birth photo. It became a secret instead. The room held its breath before anyone else did. Candlelight was unnecessary in late spring afternoon, yet the air felt dim, as if the walls themselves were absorbing what the brightness entered through the single east-facing window. Thus hovered and turned slowly, each particle catching the light and drifting away, like thoughts that refused to set. The parlor was narrow, built more for propriety than comfort. Its wallpaper faded into a pattern no one remembered choosing. A clock rested on the mantel, its ticking steady and indifferent, counting seconds without curiosity or mercy. In that measured quiet, worn saw upholstery bat chair, her posture careful, rehearsed, almost taut. Her hands were folded at the end of her lap, fingers pasted into cute and shaken. She wore a dark dress, plain and marched, a kind to numb by questions. It was the uniform of someone who expected to be overlooked, someone who had learned that being seen too clearly could be dangerous. On her lap rested a bundled infant, wrapped with care that bordered on precision. The child was small, silent, and still in a way that felt deliberate, arranged right at the hand. Photographer stood some steps away, his shoes scuffing softly against the wooden floor as he dotted the tripod. His fingers were stained with ink and chemical residue, the marks of a trade that dealt in permanence. He'd taken portraits of shopkeepers, soldiers, newlyweds, and families, want proof that they existed, that they belonged to the record that time. He threw the cloth over his head and leaned toward the king, peering through the lens as though were keel and sat in pride. The dark contained quaid worked behind him. Outside, the worm was changing. Newspapers spoke of distant trenches and telegrams arrived with thin official language that carried grief across oceans. But inside this parlor, history processed itself. This moment was meant to be ordinary, a motherhood portrait, a ritual as familiar as baptism or census taking, proof that one fulfilled her role, that a child had arrived and could be cranched. An age that trusted paper and photographs more than voices, an image with declaration. Mothers were meant to smile in such pictures, even when they were tired, even when the future was uncertain. A smile signaled gratitude, stability, and compliance. Children were meant to move, to fuss, to blur slightly during long exposures, their restlessness forgiven as a sign of life. The photographer had seen all before. He expected a faint smile, a blink, brought to smile cry that would require another attempt. But if you studied the scene through the glass, Sutton unsettled him. The woman did not smile. Her mouth remained a straight, quiet line, neither tense nor relaxed. Her eyes were open, but they were not focused on him or the camera. They drifted past the lens, toward a space that did not exist within the room. It was the look of someone listening for something that would not return. He adjusted the lens, lengthened the exposure time. The light was low and the shadows gathered easily in corners and folds of fabric. He waited for the infant to stir. It did not. The woman's grip did not change. Her arms held the bundle with a care that was exact, as though she had been instructed where to place each fold of cloth, how to angle the small head just so. He noticed the stones, of course. Any trained eye would. But noticing was not the same as naming. Name was not part of the profession. He said nothing. Professionals rarely did. The unspoken agreement between tradespeople and their subjects was simple: do the work, collect the proof, and move on. Questions complicated things. Silence kept schedules intact. The seconds stretched. The clock ticked. Somewhere down the hall, a floorboard tweaked, pricked for draft, or the shifting way of the house itself. The photographer held his breath as the exposure continued, counting his head, watching for the smallest movement that never came. Doon's gaze remains distant, her face pale but composed. When the shutter finally closed, it did so with a soft, staccato second. The moan sealed. Light edged itself onto the plate, fixing fabric, skin, and shadow into a single, unchanging record. What had been fragile became permanent. What had been temporary became history. After the woman lowered her eyes. Only then did her hands begin to tremble, the motion small and quickly controlled. The photographer looked away, pretending to busy himself equipment. He did not offer congratulations. He did not comment on the child. The silence between them thickened, filled with things that did not need to be spoken to be understood. He packed his tools carefully, each movement practiced. The woman rose when he was finished, still holding the bundle. For a moment she seemed unsure of where to go, as if the chair had been the only place she had permission to exist. Then she turned and left the room, whose steps measured, his shoulders squared against a wake that could not be seen. No one asked why the baby never cried. No one asked why the photograph had taken longer than usual. In 1917, questions were a luxury, and answers were often more trouble than they were worth. The plate was developed, washed, and dried. The image emerged slowly, a familiar alchemy of chemicals revealing outlines and expressions. As she was, see in a narrow parlor, a mother by every visible measure. Infant lane rawns wrapped in piecework, and glance was unremarkable. The kind of photograph that will be slipped into an album that ceremony. The photographer Monty wrote the date in neat script beneath the image and moved on to the next job. The album that received the photograph was already thick with life. Birthdays marked by candles and crooked smiles. Weddings framed by stiff collars and hopeful eyes. Root portraits take outside churches and town halls. The fate is blended together into a collective memory. The 1917 food dot found its place Mooden and Udned Beige hiding an extraordinary sobbed. It did not enact a job. It did not demand attention. It simply existed, doing the quiet work photo rats often do, stand in for a story no one wanted to tell. Then something near, the faint discomfort to far the inch I shall. Both looked at closely might have noticed the one's eyes the way they seemed to look to the mind rather than into. They meant a font the stones to the chine, the accent to the song, affections that usually betrayed moon. But most did not look closely. Albums are rarely sty. They are flipped through skin, trusted. The photograph was accepted as proof of a beginning, a record of arrival. Time passed. The war ended. New photographs joined the old ones. The wounds inked faded slightly as the paper aged, the edges softening. The dust that floated in the parlor that afternoon settled long ago slipped away by other hands over the years. The clock of the mantel was replaced. The house changed oars, but the photograph remained patient and intact. It carried within it a sense that was difficult to name. Not joy, not pride, something quieter, something final. With the image had truly captured was not a celebration, the threshold. Not a beginning but ending carefully disguised as its opposite. Though shaped by expectation and necessity, by a world that demanded appearances even when Riyadh refused to cooperate. Dawn had sought because she was told to sit. She held a child because she was told it mattered, because Pooh's acquired. The camera had done its work faithfully, without judgment, without mercy. Years later, when the photograph was rediscovered and studied with new eyes, that lingering discomfort would find its name. But in the spring of 1917, all that existed was the quiet after the shutter closed, the weight of what had been recorded, the knowledge shared but unspoken that something precious had already slipped away before the light ever touched the lens. The truth lay pressed flat within the image, waiting for time, for curiosity, for someone willing to look long enough to feel the silence and ask what it was trying to say. In 1917, silence was not only common, it was trained. It was stitched into manners, folded into prayer books, and taught as early as trained, especially to wean. Silence was how a woman survived when her life was measured in use force, obedience, and endurance. Words were dangerous things. They trialed. They invited judgment. So most women learn to let the thoughts stay behind their eyes and their pain remain unnamed. The mother in the photograph had learned this well. She lived in boarding house owned by her relatives, and no place that smelled of bio-catted cool dust and strength. Reputation mattered more than warmth there. Clean curtains divided more than guttering. The judges were gauged like family heirlooms. When a pregnancy began to show, the announced. It arrived quietly like a draft through a closed door. It was spoken of only in lowered voices, if at all, and always behind walls. Prayers Brownfoot at night whispered into full hands asking for forgiveness without daring to say what forgiveness was for. Sin was easier to man who had no name. She kept working as long as she could, sweeping hallways, folding linen, keeping her head down. The other residents noticed, of course, that always did. As lingered, conversations sat when she entered a home, but no one asked her anything directly. That would have required acknowledgement. Instead, silence did the work. Silence protected the house. Silence protected the family name. Silence ensured that nothing had to change. When the time came, she was moved into a small back room away from visitors. The bed creaked under her weight and the wallpaper peeled slightly near the window. She labored mostly alone. Pain was another thing women were expected to mend quietly. The child was born weak, too quiet from the start. The doctor arrived once, summoned quickly and discreetly, his coat still carrying the smoke of the street. He examined the infant, patient hand as its pushing a reel. His scruple he lied on scrap of paper not to no one particular enough for dot. No bridge to target forward. No official record. No midwife lingered to watch the sheet or speak gentle reassurances. Of no celebration, no visitors, no soft congratulations whispered or crew. Explanation came quickly and neatly. Illness, they said, frailty, God's will. Each phrase spoken softly, via to stir the fragile ore things. The subject is closed at the same breath and traced the true whose heavier explanation of. The baby did not grow weaker of the days and did not feed slowly, and died, and was like as taken. His soul body cooled in a room while the house carried its routines below. Breakfast was prepared. Floors were swept, life continuing with the practiced ease of people who had earned a step around convenient truths. The infant was wrapped carefully, the cloth smoothed, and just with hands that trembled oil when they were alone. The positioning was precise, not the instinctive care celebration with the careful arrangement of necessity. This was what that memory wanted, and with that proof, a photograph was needed. In that era, proof mattered, proof of birth, proof of propriety. Proof that things had unfolded as they were supposed to even when they had not. A living child could they want openly. A dead one, especially one that arrived at uncomfortable circumstances, threatened questions, and questions threatened fragile balance of respectability. The food breath on for a solution, and ings could sting and foriad. It could satisfy curiosity without invading conversation. It could be shown when then put away. The rules were unspoken, everyone stood them. The photographer suspected he had seen stillness before. He had learned to recognize it, the weight of it, the unnatural calm that did not belong to sleep. He noticed the way the infant did not shift, the way the mother held the bundle with a tension that spoke of her rather ease. He noticed the silence, but suspicion was not accusation. The accusation was nice place. His role was to document, not to judge. So he adjusted his lens and lengthened the exposure, telling himself that the light was poor, that the shadows were stubborn. The relatives knew. They'd known before the doctor knew. They'd known before a cloth was folded. Knowledge settled them heavily, yet they carried it the way they carried everything else, with tight mouths and careful glances. The concerns not cruelty in the wee history often imagines. It was or control. The belief that the sorter was a knowledge spread. They believed Salos was a kaidos. That concealment was protection, and so they allowed the photograph. They arranged the chair. They ensured the dress was proper. They stood just outside the room listening to the shutter clothes. The mother obeyed, not because she did not understand what was happening, but because obedience was the only language she had been taught. She held what she had only lost. She sat when she was taught to sit. She lit what she was told to look, even if her eyes could not quite focus on the present. Her grief was private, not because she wanted it that way, but because there was no other option. No one asked her what she needed. No one asked her what she felt. A photograph took place as planned, a quiet ritual of denial, rest as remembrance. In that era, a stillborn child carried shame. He raised questions about morality, oath, and divine favor. Shame demanded concealment. It wedded that stories be smooth and it is soften, health and sharp remain. A photograph could do there. It could transform loss into something acceptable, something that fit neatly between other images in an album. The photograph became a compromise between grief and denial. It allowed society to look briefly, nod solemnly, and then turn away, satisfied that it had acknowledged enough. After the tautologer left, the house returned to its routines. The chair was moved back against the wall. The room was aired out. The infant was taken away quietly. There was no funeral with open doors, no gathering of mourners, no public acknowledgement that a life had ended. The mother returned to her duties when she was able, body healed at time, where silence deepened. The photograph was mounted, stored, date written ebony. The rest down ages of life continuing a stow point a turning world. No one competent of required admission. It required someone to say loud what everyone already knew. So instead there was small gesture, cup of tea placed within reach, an extra blanket left folded at the foot of her bed, kindness without words, sympathy without responsibility. The injustice did not arrive in the form of cruelty shouted or fists raised. It arrived softly in omissions and expectations. It lived in what was permitted and what was not, in what could be shown and what had to be hidden. Silence wrapped itself around her suffering until it felt like duty, until breaking felt like betrayal. She carried on as women were expected to do, her grief pressed flat beneath routine. Her photographed in its root, a stand place of truth. It answered questions that no one dared to ask, and doing so it buried sunken would not stay buried forever. The image remained patient and unchanged, holding then to wait on unspoken injustice. Waiting for tang to press. Waiting for eyes willing to see not just what was flat but what had been carefully left at. The truth surfaced decades later, not through a voice breaking under guilt, not through a confession whispered at the end of life, but through chemistry and patience. In the 1940s, a photographer's studio no longer smelled of fresh chemicals and urgency. It smelled of age. The dust settled into corners and drawers that had not been opened in years. Light filtered through tiled windows that once framed hopeful facings, now illuminating shelves lined with envelopes, glass plates, and bill of paper. The photographer's gone by then, his work reduced to objects and habits inherited by a son who remembered watching his father disappear beneath a dark cloth, who remembered the careful way he handled glass as if he could remember being touched. The son did never intend to uncover anything that morning. He was cataloging, nothing more. Putting order to what time had scattered, he moved slowly, respecting the way what he handled. Each negative was a frozen moment, a fragment of someone else's certainty. When he came upon the plate from 1917, it did not announce itself. It was cracked at one corner, clouded by age, its edges dulled, but it was intact. He paused longer than usual, turning it slightly so the light caught the faint outline beneath the film. Something about it resisted being dismissed. Curiosity, quiet and persisted, took hold. He decided to reprint it. Not because he expected a revelation, because old plates often held surprises when treated with care. He prepared the chemicals more slowly than he might have in his youth, letting the temperature settle, measuring by instinct rather than haste. As the ink began to emerge in the tray, he adjusted the contrast, prolonging the process. He'd learned that shadows, when given time, spoke more clearly. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the building and the soft moan of liquid. What emerged was subtle, not dramatic might, no obvious sign, just details that felt wrong once seen. The infant's eyes were closed too firmly, not in the soft surrender of sleep, but in finality that did not invite reopening. The skin tone lacked the warmth he had seen hinted at portraits. It was flat, uniform, untouched by the faint mottling breath and blood. Beneath the careful folds of cloth, there was a line that should not have been there, a suggestion rigidity were soft as prolonged. Stillness beyond sleep, the kind that did not shift when light changed. The son felt the temperature in the room drop, though the radiator clicked on as it always did. He leaned closer, then stepped back, letting the image settle. He had seen death before. He had printed photographs of wakes and memorials, knew the difference between rest and absence. This was absence arranged to resemble rest. He compared the image to others, mothers holding infants, newborns wrapped hastily, their faces caught mid-expression. The differences were small, but together they formed the pattern. He turned to medical text, old ones his father had kept for reference. The descriptions aligned with what the photograph suggested. The conclusion did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly, like cold air filling a room. The photograph had not been a celebration. It had been a performance, a careful act designed to satisfy expectation. The son sat with that thought longer than he intended. He imagined his father in that narrow parlor, seeing what he must have seen, choosing silence as part of the transaction. He did not judge him harshly. He understood the world his father had worked in. A world where questions threatened livelihoods, where seeing too much made one complicit. Still, understanding did not erase the weight of what had been done. He began to search the wickets. It was an old habit in the Idlan with the study. He pulled ledgers from shelves, their spines cracked, their pages yellowed. Birth registrations, burial entries, names written carefully as if ni handwriting can impose order on chaos. He found nothing for the child in the photograph. No certificate, no record of a service, no marker of passage, only a brief ledger note tucked between expenses and repairs. Female infant unregistered. Written the same ink used to account for new lenses and broken equipment. The line was small, easily overlooked and devastating as restraint. The mother's name appeared elsewhere. Census lists, mental agreements, faded signatures that spoke of a life lived quietly within the margins of other people's property. She had died years earlier. No obituary lingered to tell her story. No public record spoke of her grief. She never spoke publicly of the photograph. Silence had followed her faithfully. But the son discovered something else while sorting through a box of personal effects his father had kept for reasons never explained. A small prayer book, its cover worn smooth by use. Inside, folded carefully, were letters written a steady hand that softened only at the edges. He read them slowly, respectfully. The words were plain, no dramatic flourishes, just observations and small confessions addressed to no one in particular. In several letters, one line appeared again and again, unchanged. They asked me to hold what I already lost. The sentence carried no accusation, no anger, just fact. A record as honest as any photograph. The son read until the words blurred. The revelation did not expose a crime in the way history often demands. There was no villain to name, no law clearly broken. What it revealed was something quieter and perhaps worse. A system, an agreement between custom and convenience. A world that required grief to pose, to perform calm, to present itself in ways that did not disturb others. The photograph had not lied, and complied, had given people what they needed to look away. The son placed a reprinted image beside the original. Side by side, the differences spoke more clearly. He imagined the mother's arms holding weight that did not belong there anymore. He imagined the instructions given softly, perhaps with the assurance that this was for the best. For her. For everyone. He imagined his father adjusting the lens, telling himself that some truths were not his to tell. As days passed, the image followed him. He saw it in the way light fell across his workbench, in the careful way he handled new plates. He thought about how many other photographs might carry similar silences, how many albums might hold endings disguised as beginnings. The knowledge did not bring satisfaction. It brought responsibility. He did not destroy the photograph. He did not hide it away again. He annotated, carefully, respectfully. He added context where there had been none. He preserved the letters alongside the image, allowing the woman's words to stand beside her likeness. In a small act but felt necessary, a way of refusing the final silence. The studio changed after that, not in obvious ways. The shelves remained. The chemicals still smelled sharp and familiar. But the son worked differently. He waited longer. He looked closer. He learned to trust the discomfort that settled when something did not align. He understood that photographs were not neutral. They carried intention. They carried compromise. They carried the weight of what people were willing to see. Years later, when others encountered the image, they would feel that same pause, that sense that someone was being asked of them to look, to consider, to sit with the quiet injustice of a moment staged for comfort rather than truth. The photograph no longer belonged only to the album. It belonged to memory. The album it was taken would change hands again. The boarding house would be renovated, repurposed, its runes stripped to the wallpaper that once absorbed whispered quiet. But the image would endure, not as evidence of motherhood fulfilled, as a testament to what silence demanded. The system that required grief to be palatable would eventually loosen its grip, but not without leaving marks behind. The sun cloaks belligerent returned to the shelf. He turned off the light in the studio and stood for a moment in the dark, listening to the building cell. He understood then that some truths wait for the right errands not to accrue but to remel it, and that remembrance, quiet and careful with its own form of justice. Some names do not seek punishment, they seek acknowledgement. They seek a moment where what was held in silence is finally allowed to rest. The house where the photograph was taken no longer stands, and you walk past the place now, there's nothing to suggest that it ever did. Brick and glass rise where wood and wallpaper once absorbed whispers. The windows are wider, the floors are polished. Progress has a way of arriving quietly and then pretending it was always there. The old boarding house was dismantled piece by piece, its beams awed away, its narrow rooms erased with a ceremony. No plaque marks the site. No record explains what once happened behind those walls. Had the image survives, and leaves the structure they contained. It travels then through archives and lecture halls, protecting unto clean brains often mislabeled versed layers. A mother and child 1917. Routine, ordinary, until someone pauses long enough for the story to be told in full. When the truth emerged, it did not bring punishment. There were no trials for silence. No verdicts for cruelty disguised as custom. No formal apology issued by institutions that had long since changed their names. The people who might have been held accountable were already gone, their choices dissolved into the anonymity of time. What the truth brought instead was recognition. A slow, careful acknowledgement of what had been asked of one woman and what had been taken from her in return. Recognition does not raise the dead. It does not undo what was done, but alters the way mourned is held in memory. For years, the photograph existed as evidence of conformity. It fit neatly into a narrative of motherhood that required no questions. But once the context of restored, once the letters were read and records compared, the image shifted. Historians began describing it as what was post-modern portrait, a practice once common and rarely questioned. Families had photographed the dead for generations, especially children who had no other mar in the world. The custom had been practical as much as emotion, a way to remember, a way for existence. Known and named portraits to much softened to wait, a only short print of the more outright, it forced the viewer to confront not just death, but the expectations placed awry. The photograph now demands a different kind of attention. Viewers are encouraged to look longer, to notice the stillness that once passed unremarked, to understand the social rules that made such an image necessary. It is no longer presented as a curiosity, but as a case study, a quiet indicting system that prioritizes awe over empathy. The mother's letters are preserved in acid-free folders, their paper that, their ink fade that ritual. Archivists handle them with gloves, aware that these words, once folded inside a prayer book, now carry a weight their writer could not have imagined. Her sentences are plain. There is no attempt to dramatize her pain, at restraint what gives them power. The words speak not only for herself, but for many who were taught to endure quietly and leave no trace of their suffering. The photograph is no longer a teen. These studied, prosed over, approach with care. Students aren't not only what they see but what they do not. They are asked to consider why the image existed at all, why it was needed, why silence felt like duty. And in that careful looking, something shifts. The image no longer hides the truth, it carries it. It becomes a vessel rather than a veil. History, it comes out, then only written in wars and treaties. It is written expectations, in rules that go unspoken but shape lives just as surely as laws. The photograph reminds us of what society once asked the vulnerable to endure quietly, to perform calm, to present loss in a way that did not disturb others. It reveals how systems of respectability can turn grief into something transactional, something that must be displayed correctly to be accepted in all. Some names were never recorded. The child's name does not appear in a ledger. It was never written on certificate, etched into stone. In the official sense, the child did not exist. Some children were never alive in a way the world demanded. They did not cry. They did not move. They did not leave behind the kinds of marks that institutions recognize, but absence does not mean insignificance. Time has a way of reopening ledgers that once closed too quickly. It brings forgotten lines back into focus. It allows new eyes to read old words differently. The mother's name survives, but only barely. Census lines, rental records, a few signatures, but at the photograph in lines who remain a shadow, a statistic. Instead, she becomes a presence. A woman who obeyed because obedience was expected, who held what she had already lost because refusal was not an option. Her endurance is not romanticized. It is honored by being seen clearly. The place where the house once steered does not romantically. The city has moved on. Traffic passes. People hurry by with their own concerns. But memory does not require building. It requires attention. Each time the photograph is shown with its story intact, the silence it once enforced loosens its grip. Each time her words are read, folded no longer, something is returned to her. Not justice in the formal sense. Not retribution, but acknowledgement. There is a temptation when faced with such stories to search for villains, to assign blame in simple terms, but the truth here resists that comfort. The harm was carried out through compliance, through rules followed without question, through kindness offered without courage. That's what makes it unsettling. It forces us to consider how easily systems can demand harm without ever naming it as such. The photograph endures because it teaches this quietly. It does not accuse. It does not shout, it waits. It waits for views willing to sit with discomfort, willing to accept that progress does not erase responsibility. Understanding the past means acknowledging not only what happened or why it was allowed to happen. Some names only find peace when the truth is told, not loudly, not with spectacle, but carefully, with respect, with the patience to let shadows speak. The house is gone. The silence is not. It lingers lighter now, transformed. No longer a weight pressing down, but a reminder held up. An echo that asks us to look again and to remember what we once chose not to see.